Carbohydrates are #1 source of energy. This week we're going to look at carbohydrates. Carbohydrates include sugars, starches, and fibers. And as of late, the last 10 years, carbohydrates have really started to get a bad rap. We hear a lot about low-carb diets, or like Atkins diets, which is no carbs. The problem is that carbohydrates are our #1 energy source. So when you think about last couple weeks, we talked about comparing the human body to a car. When you are not providing the fuel needed for a car, the gasoline needed, eventually the car isn't going to be able to function because it doesn't have the fuel that it needs. And this is often a concern with very low carb or no carb diets, that what are we doing to our bodies when we are denying it its main fuel source? Carbohydrates have a really long history in terms of how they have been processed. The grains that people consumed, tens of thousands of years ago were typically soaked, sprouted, and then either toasted or boiled into porridges, like oatmeal type consistency. They were dark in color. They were very coarse in texture. I mean, think about oatmeal. It's very coarse. It's not necessarily smooth. But these mixtures that were created contained all of the components of the grain from which they were made. So nothing was removed, and all of the nutritional components that are in the grain were kept in this particular process. However, over time, we started to refine grains. So you're going to hear that word often when we talk about foods, a refined grain, or refined wheat, or refined flour. And basically, this had started in the Industrial Revolution. And by refining grains, we were able to produce them on a mass scale. So again, population is increasing. So we want to feed all of these people. We figure out a way to refine various grains, so wheats, for example, in order to mass produce them. And making refined flour is going to be a very, very important dietary process, because again, we use flour to make pretty much everything, and so now we can mass produce this flour. This process is often called grinding. So not only did grinding increase the amount of grains that were available, but the flip side was that it actually, in this process, takes out more and more nutrients that were naturally found in the grain. So because we're basically taking out the coarse part of the grain, which has the most nutrition in it. So by refining it, we did make it more accessible to people. However, it becomes less nutrient dense. Eventually, over time, we've basically only used refined grains. And this has prompted the government to actually mandate that nutrients be put back into the grain. So we've stripped the grain of its nutrient value. We've made it available to all kinds of people, but now governments are saying you need to go back and re-add the nutrients into those grains, because we have a population that's starting to experience nutritional deficiencies because we've removed them in this process. So we're starting to see a shift right now in terms of going back to producing grains in a way that keeps the original nutrients in there versus using this refined way, which strips the nutrients out of it. This week we're going to look at, like I said, carbohydrates, what they are, how we get them in their diet, how our body uses them to make energy, and how it became to be the #1 fuel source for our bodies. We're going to look at what happens when you have not enough carbohydrates, and vice versa, what can happen when you have too much carbohydrates. And we're going to look at the difference between fiber, what happens if you are fiber deficient or if you have too much fiber, all of these different things that have to do with carbohydrates, sugars, starches, and fibers.